All right. So here I am. This is obviously the teacher view, so it looks a little bit different, but I'm down here. We're on week 4 of the semester. And I'm like, are we? And so we're starting the new category, which I'm calling Exoticism. And you can see as you scroll down, the numbers are which week we're on, if you ever feel like you're getting lost. And we kind of work in these categories. And each category is about 3 weeks long. And the reason for that organization is that if you have taken my Dance 100 class, you'll notice that it's all pretty much like it starts broad, as this one does, but then it pretty much narrows down to a chronological path, looking at dance evolving on the concert stage from the influences of world dances, but then mostly looking at Western EuroCentric concert dance from, we spent some time looking at court dance and ballet, so that would be 1400s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and then 19th century to current. In this class, I wanted to set up in a different fashion. So we're going to look at dances from all different times in each category, but the theme connecting them is going to be what is like a philosophical or what's the right word here? Anyway, the thematic joinder for this one is about how we value and devalue dance in particular, but also bodies, based on this idea that something is quote unquote exotic. Yeah. So we started, let me come in a little bit. In this category in general, we're going to talk a lot about how colonialism has influenced our Western Eurocentric idea about what is exotic as opposed to what is not exotic. And so there's a few ideas that I want to make sure we get a chance to discuss here today. Let's come back. I'd like to have a little question for you. And you guys can answer this verbally or you can pop into chat. But can you please, everybody, answer me? Let me see. 1. Have you ever been called exotic? And that could be a description of your dancing or your outfit, or it could, if you are a woman, sometimes that's a way that someone might hit on you at a dance club. And number 2, do you think exotic has a positive or negative connotation? I'm going to simplify that by saying a good thing or a bad thing. And this is totally me just trying to get you guys to think about your feelings about these words, because I want us to have an idea how the words that we're going to use in discussion have different sort of emotional connotations, right? So while you guys are, does anybody want to chat? You guys are welcome to, yeah, go for it, Jacques.
So I don't believe at least, let me think. I feel like I might have been called exotic at some point, mainly because like I'm dark skinned.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because I was like born near the equator or whatever, and then I might be confusing it with tropical or whatever, but like I feel like I might have been called exotic at some point in my life. But like yeah, going on for the second question, I believe being called exotic, depending on like the context, but in most contexts that I would probably hear it in, would be like a compliment. Because whenever I hear exotic, I think like, oh, you're unique and you have like this energy that like not many people have. And then also like since I play video games, like exotic is sometimes used as an adjective to describe like really um like either really good guns or like not guns, sorry, really good like items, or like items that are that provide unique game features or something. So
Yeah, like
I consider
hard to find loot.
yeah, so I consider it something to be like good or something.
All right. Looking in the chat. Oh, exotic cars. Ned, can you give us an example of what an exotic car might be and what a not exotic car might be?
It's like a Ferrari would be considered more exotic than like a Honda, in a sense. But in that context, it's always going to be more positive. I feel like almost when you're referring to items, the term exotic is always there isn't really a bad connotation with it. But when you refer to people, I feel like it's kind of weird. Like it's like it doesn't sound like for me it doesn't sound like a compliment per se.
Yeah, I think actually you made an amazingly good point there. When we're talking about items, exotic almost always has a positive connotation. But when we talk about people, we start to be like, uh, wait, what? Why do we think that is? What is it about calling a person exotic that makes it start to seem a little shady? Like there could be what? There's no wrong answers here. Throw some guesses out, anybody. Yeah, go for it, Jack.
I think it might be considered like sort of weird for someone to be called that, because I guess it sort of implies like depending who it's coming from, like say it's coming from somebody like a white person or something, and then they're calling somebody who's from like clearly from like another country, like, oh yeah, you're exotic. It might sort of alienate the person who's being called that because like I don't know, it's like again, something that you don't really hear a lot of people call other people.
Yeah, yeah. And if I'm looking over here in our chat, I'm just going to read a couple things out. A lot of you are saying that you believe exotic is a good thing, which I agree. Um, but I also see a number of you mentioning that it sounds weird. I would be confused by it. It's not necessarily bad. We're all different people, which is a good thing, are some quotes I'm reading here. But also, when Michelle is saying that she's been called exotic because she has really dark hair and she looks like she's from another country. And I think we might be getting a really good idea about what the implication there, especially when it's coming from a white person. Exotic is othering on the basis of race. Yeah? Go ahead, Ned.
I think it's an interesting term because I feel like as people we all want to a degree assimilate with each other, and being called exotic is kind of being called, hey, you're super, you really stand out, but
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily in a good way or a bad way. But
Mm-hmm.
like Michelle was saying, she was called exotic based off her dark hair, so it's kind of like um it's the item being called exotic, maybe not the person. It's an interesting way to look at things. Like your hair is very exotic. It feels like a compliment that way.
But if it's you are very exotic, then it takes on that questionable racial tone? Question mark? Sorry, that was meant to be a question. It didn't quite get phrased that way. Do you think here, let's just go like straight for the jugular here. Do you think it would be appropriate for you to call someone that you don't know exotic, even if you intend it as a compliment? Like if you just walked up to a stranger and you were like, wow, you look so exotic. What do you guys think?
Sorry, there's an airplane. I personally think in general calling somebody like uh an adjective that's sort of just like out there, like, oh, you're exotic, or like, oh, you're beautiful, or like, oh, you're ugly, regardless of what it is,
Mm.
it's still like gonna be out there. But like going into exotic, um, it's definitely gonna intensify like the weirdness of like being called exotic. Like if somebody you know or somebody who you like sort of know calls you exotic, like yeah, okay, that might be sort of weird. Like okay, that's I don't hear that a lot. But then if like a stranger calls you that, it might be like, what? Like what do you mean by that? You know?
Yeah, like if a stranger calls you that, you could be really offended. But then if your best friend who looks like you says you are exotic and it's beautiful, then it might feel different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Anybody else want to throw in their 2 cents or 200 bucks on this question? Yeah, Keon.
Oh, excuse me. I feel like being called it, it's like it really depends on the group of people you're with. If you really stand out on the group you're in, people can call you exotic, and it could be interpreted as a good thing or a bad thing, depending on what is exotic about you.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Let's see. Okay. I'm gonna move forward a little bit, but remember, I love having you guys pop into conversation with me. So feel free to like raise your hand, or even if I'm sharing screen, then I can't always see your raised hands show up. So do feel free to like unmute yourself and interrupt me. So it's okay. Just want to remind you that I like that. I know probably not everybody is down with that. Oh, okay. Let me. I'm going to share my screen some more. So I apologize. It's going to be a little bit like bouncy around with my windows, but I'm trying to like put my notes up more and give you a little bit more visual, so you don't just have to stare at me all day. I know I should put some art behind me since I'm lecturing in here for a while. Okay, so what I want to talk about here, these notes are pretty much for today. There's a little bit at the bottom getting into next week's reading, which will be about the aesthetic of cool, just because last semester I had to combine these two conversations. But what we're talking about today is the idea of exoticism and how that has been monetized in dance, and how that affects the dance, and where we end up with this valuing and devaluing of things that are quote unquote exotic, right? So the thing that is probably the purest form of fetishizing things which seem strange and extraordinary would be circuses, which is why I started with the video that was on when you guys came in. Is Cirque du Soleil, which is a company that is international at this point, but originally started in Canada, and they are so super famous that they hire from all over the world. So it's like a giant, we call it cattle call in dance, like 1,000 people show up to audition for one part. But it's also, I mean, it's a really international cast usually for each of their shows, and you've probably heard of other ones. The show that we were watching at the beginning of today's Zoom was Curios Cabinet of Curiosities, and each show has a theme, and the theme for that one is basically steampunk, which is this idea of taking like Victorian era technology, but you're also mixing it with the other half, that word, the punk part, comes from actually science fiction. There is a science fiction genre called cyberpunk, and so that takes place in the future, but it's about I mean, the punk part refers to basically that there's usually in a cyberpunk science fiction story some sort of rebellion against an overarching empire, basically. So steampunk is sort of like a melange of those two ideas. There's obviously like a big Victorian organizational structure, and then there's some sort of rebellion going on against that in some way, shape, or form. You may have heard of other Cirque du Soleil shows. There's lots of links in our class, such as Zumanity, which is my favorite, like there's just a ton of them. So I hope that you've seen them. I'm not sure, actually. I take that back. I don't think Zumanity is my favorite anymore. I think Curios and, oh, what's the one I'm thinking of? Volta, which is on roller skates. But what they are a highly choreographed version of Circus. And what is Circus? We got to talk about that. Basically, you have a vaudeville show that is organized not just around singing and dancing and slapstick comedy plays, which it has all of those things still, but extremely exoticized or othered or wild or over the top version of those things, right? So in the modern day version of Curios, we saw a little intro and you could kind of see like a bunch of different cast members basically giving you a teaser of the act that they were going to do later, right? So we saw some hand bouncers in the background of one of the shot, and they just like did one lift where somebody did a handstand on somebody else's hands, and someone else like was upside down with their legs in the air. Meanwhile, the two drumming specialists did basically like a hand and table slapping duet, right? And the stage turns and you can see people flipping in the background. You see someone come through with a bicycle because they're going to do bicycle tricks later on. And you can see some of the actors giving you hints at the theme of their play that they might play. Like there's a small person and a big person, and they're going to do magic together. There's a juggling act, all of those things. And that has been the format of circus forever, never. And what did, I'm trying to think if I need a good like intro circus, note to self, intro circus image. Circus, 18th century. Let's do it. Come on, images. So circus in the America had all of those acts. They also had what we call geek acts, which would be people who have differentiations of the bodies that would be played up in a really extreme way. For example, people who, forgive me if I get the terminology wrong, but people who are born with dwarfism or midgetism would be, touted as the world's smallest person. Or if you think of Elephant Man, who had a strangely formed shape of his head, was described as being an elephant, even though that was absolutely not true. And these were often both a place where people who were otherwise extremely excluded from society could find acceptance. And this included not only people who had physical disabilities or differences, but also people who were resistant to moral codes, or people who were not of the leading race or ethnicity in their society and didn't want to like sit down and shut up. Women who were not wanting to just get married and stay within the home sometimes ended up in a circus. Animal acts for sure. Trying to think if there's anything else that I want to make sure we mention going in. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how there was both the Toba circuit or the Chitlin circuit of vaudeville performing acts, and also the vaudeville circuit of vaudeville performing acts, right? So these are two circles around the nation in which people traveled to perform. So the circuses also toured the nation. And the interesting thing about all of these touring companies is that remember we talked about how dances evolve in a regional area, and each region creates a name for their dance step, and it might look the same, or some person might go visit another area and dance that dance step, and it's learned in a different place, but it gets a different name. So circuses were also a way that movement styles were shared in the time before video at all, right? So like you couldn't watch a dance step in the 1800s. Because there was no video. But you could go to see a circus, and a circus performer might have taken a step that they learned somewhere and put it in their act. And the same is true with things like acrobatics. And that's really where we're going to tie together circuses and dancing, is acrobatics and sort of vaudeville physical tricks, such as juggling, such as sharpshooting, such as hand balancing, which is when you are doing acrobatics like gymnastics with people balancing on each other's hands. All of those things traveled and evolved and mixed in other influences around the country and sometimes internationally, like the big circuses, Barnum and Bailey, that you've heard of before. We're definitely going to Europe and going on tour in Europe there. And they were largely segregated, especially in America. But it's important to remember that since we're going to start talking about this time where the Civil War happens and what happens after the Civil War, it's important to recognize that Europe got it right way before we did. So Britain, right, was an empire in the 1800s and before, and America was a colony that belonged to Britain until 1775-ish, right, when we broke away from them. But Britain was, even though we don't often think of it, London initially was one of the huge slave trade centers because they had all the ships initially that they were sending to West Africa. This month I learned, as part of my Black history knowledge, that the number of slaves who died on ships in the Middle Crossing is larger than the number of Jews who were killed in the Holocaust. That's just like a grim fact to note in your memory. So British and British colonial ships purchased nearly 3.5 million Africans, and under 3 million survived the Middle Passage. And really, London was one of the hugest slave trade centers during the 1700s. But what is important and valuable here to remember as per our conversation is that Britain, the British country, and British ships, although not their colonies, abolished slavery in 1807. And that is not the case in America until 1865, when we finish having the Civil War and we start getting into Reconstruction, where slavery was abolished. And so as we start to talk about the era after Reconstruction, we're going to really have some interesting points where we can look at the difference between the way that people were treated here in America versus in Europe, right? And that gives us an idea about like what was the exoticization like in America, where we have slavery as a legal idea, versus what was exoticization like in Britain, where they still fetishized people who were not white. Don't get me wrong. But like, how does that change when you have chattel slavery as something that you accept in your country? Okay, so let's talk about, we have these touring companies, right? These touring vaudeville companies. We also have touring small circus shows. If you've ever seen Carnival on HBO, it's getting quite, I think it was early 2000s, but I think it's one of my favorite series. It's fascinating and gorgeous and exciting in its magical realism. So of course I love it. There's two major things I want to talk about in terms of old school circuses. One is Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which we have an article on, and the other is the Chicago's World Fairs. So Buffalo Bill's Wild West was a enormously famous touring company, so famous that they went to England and performed like to the Queen's face, you know, like in her room, and she's talking to them after the show. And then they returned to Madison Square Garden and they put on their show in Madison Square Garden as like a place that they stayed for a long time in residence. And it's really interesting, not only because it featured Buffalo Bill, who was a fancy shooter, so he could like shoot moving targets and ride horses and flip over and all of those things with guns, but also it featured authentically real Native Americans doing quote unquote real Native American dances. And I say quote unquote not because they tried specifically to like whitewash them, but because it's interesting to talk about how they were whitewashed. So a lot of the Native Americans who performed in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show were otherwise unable to do things like travel or leave their reservations or like have any real freedom. And this is partially because of the massacre at Wounded Knee, where basically American soldiers just shot down a whole community of people who had been resistant to having their land stolen by the US government. And some of these dancers actually came from that place, and just like the plantation owners restricted dancing among the slave population, that was also true after Wounded Knee, that there was restrictions on public gathering and communal dances within the Native American communities because they did have war dances, and so any dancing then, of course, was deemed by the white people who were trying to steal their land as a possible threat. So one of the things that we know from the actual performers in the show, since they were so famous, is that they really appreciated being able to practice their dance, which they were restricted from doing in regular life. They did not. We have like actual quotes from them discussing how aware they were of the dichotomy of being put on a weird stage. And by weird stage, I mean, like these dances are normally done in a circle, right? They're religious and community dances. They're usually done in a circle, like with an audience all the way around you, who are your peers and community members who will like participate in the dance sometimes. And instead, these dances are being done on a stage, right? So a stage is generally, you have the wings on the side where you can go hide and change your clothes, and there's a backdrop behind you, so nobody's standing behind you, and everybody in the audience is out front. And that if you're normally doing a dance that moves in a circle evenly all the way around, you might not do the same shape of dance if you're trying to show the dance only to one side. And that change alters the dance steps inevitably. And then there's also the question of whether you are doing your dance as a religious rite, that you might be dancing specifically to like an idea of like asking for rain. You might be projecting upwards, rather than if you're performing that rain dance in front of an audience that's in front of you, you might change the moves by basically catering to your audience that's in front of you. And then furthermore, for example, when those Wild West shows got installed in Madison Square Garden, the whole thing became a choreographed like reenactment of the battle at Wounded Knee, so that the Native American dancers would show their war dances where they're like psyching each other up to fight, and then there would be like this choreographed pony show of the different warriors like riding horses around and pretending to shoot at each other, and then like leaders in the battle stand up and do this Del Sarchen. That's a whole nother thing to research if you're curious about, like if you think of I'm thinking of like the shortest way to mention this. There was if you think about black and white silent films and the way that everybody sort of overacted because they couldn't talk, and they would make these exaggerated facial expressions and kind of freeze in them. That comes from a style of acting called Del Sarchen acting, and it has to do with this idea that the reason why white people value Greek statues is because the poses that are in most statues are sort of in everybody's subconscious as meaningful emotional poses. And so you can do those poses and elicit response in your audience from there. This is sort of the same theory as gesture in ballet, or when you guys are watching a dance and you say, oh, this person is telling a story. A lot of the time, I think what you're identifying is that you can relate to emotional cues that are done through gesture and body position. So those gestures were put onto the dances, right? So you might like do the steps of one dance, and then you would pause and be like, I am strong and brave. I threaten other person, right? Because there's no microphones. You can't use lines when you're watching this show in a giant venue. So those dances were changed by the act of showing them. And that becomes a conundrum, right? We've mentioned a little bit about how um, how appropriation can alter a dance or a performance or a culture because someone else is doing it. But we can also have a dance or a cultural artifact be altered by the way that we show it to other people. And so we just want to talk about that because that is neither a good nor bad thing. And it, in fact, like lets a movement style evolve, but it also exoticizes it. Yeah. So when Black Elk and the Wild West show performed in front of the Queen, she made this comment that was supposed to be sort of insulting to the leaders of the show, which is, she said, if I owned you Indians, you good looking people, I would never take you around in a show like this. And she meant to say it. First of all, she knew that they weren't technically owned, like they were not slaves, but she said that word in earshot of the leaders of the show to give them basically a jab in the side, to insult the leaders of the show, that they were treating the dancers a little bit more less than human because they were the exotic part of the show, right? Even though they're Native American, we perceive them as being exotic or other. And they're like taken on tour to England. But Black Elk like sort of flipped the script on her by basically ignoring that part of the line and responding that he was very proud to perform his native dancers all over the world and to represent his nation. And the reason why this story, and you can read about it in your reading this week, is so interesting is because it really talks about the double-sidedness of exoticizing a dance. On one hand, it's making that culture look other or like a commodity or more like an item, as we were discussing earlier. And on the other hand, it can really give some economic power and cultural power to those group of people who are being exoticized, right? If you just dance like everybody else is dancing, nobody's going to pay for tickets to see you. But if you take on this adjective of exotic, then you become an item, question mark, that becomes something that is profitable. So I mentioned this. Let's come back to modern days for a second, and we'll go back again. Whoop. Come here. Let's listen to Quick Step talk about breaking. Here we go.
When I got into breaking, being that what I saw with tap, Lindy Hop, swing, jazz, I was like, that's not happening with breaking. This has got to remain raw. It's got to remain ours. Because, you know, we were learning lessons in Zulu Nation about how we function as a people, what is ours, and how things fell out of our hands and became commercial, became codified. Now, let's fast forward to the present. 40 years later, what's happening with breaking, like America's Best Dance Crew. In that small window, the first 3 or 4 breakers were winning. And after that, they were like, okay, no, we're gonna do this other versions of like hip hop studio dance, and they're gonna be winning. And then it became kind of a little bit quirky, commercial. And then the audience that was raw, that was watching it, then turned away. There's a parallel that's happening now. We're still very young in the game when it comes to culture. We're only 40 years young. Super young compared to anything else that's been around for 500 years, 600 years. So I can imagine what was happening in ballet in the beginning and the struggles it was going through. Who made up what, you know, where was it made up, what town, We're going through that. We're still defining it ourselves.
So the question there that's being posed is this question of how breakdance, right, which basically has only been around since the 70s. And at the time of the 70s, it was on the East Coast where they're having these dance parties often outside, and dancers are teaching each other these moves that are partially acrobatic, that are partially evolved possibly from martial dances, right, where the slaves both in throughout the New Americas who weren't allowed to obviously fight had to practice self-defense or martial movement, and they could sometimes disguise it as dance, and that's what you have with capoeira. But those sort of like fluid martial movements happen all over the world, and there are many things that happen as those things have evolved in different places, right? In Japan, you have a really slow motion formal version that's called bukaku, where you're like practicing your sword movements in absolute slow motion. And the idea in that training is that if you can do it super slow, you're going to be extremely precise when you move quickly. But there's also African martial dance movements, and those elements are perhaps some of the influence into breakdancing, but there's also just like the gritty downness of buck dancing that we saw last week is definitely related to up rocks and down rocks. And then where do you get these crazy spins from? And part of that is because it's fun to learn those things and to be able to do freezes. But also part of it is because it is exoticized and passed on by people being fascinated by watching those dances or gymnastic or acrobatic or hand bouncing movements as they were in circuses. So there's our little rough connection, acrobatics and breakdancing. I want to switch slightly gears and talk a little bit more. Oh, sorry, I didn't take you with me. Share screen. Talk a little bit more about the World's Fairs. We have this Benedict article to read. Okay, the World's Fairs were basically these expressions of imperial power and business acumen that were begun in the Victorian times by the Brits. The first one happened in London, and it was a way, remember, no internet, there was film. Film was like shown off for the first time at one of the World's Fairs. But they were a way for each nation to come and show technological advances that they had created in order to attract more business. So, for example, in the World's Fair in England, they brought the first steam locomotive, right? And railroads forever changed the entire world, and like steam-powered engines were the reason why we had the first industrial revolution. But because it was a World's Fair, this wasn't just about showing off technology locally. It was about like the British Empire and the French Empire and the Portuguese Empire showing off what they had to trade. And that often meant showing off the colonies that you had taken possession of. And as the World's Fairs went on and on for a while, those colonies that had eventually started to free themselves also wanted to come to the World's Fairs to basically step onto the world stage and start to make a name for themselves. Now, this obviously wasn't going to go very smoothly because the World's Fairs were usually hosted by white nations who were imperial powers, right? So on one hand, they had the wherewithal to be able to basically build, usually a World's Fair involves building a temporary city. So in England, they built this essentially a giant greenhouse out of steel and glass, which had never been seen before. When it happened in Paris, they built the Eiffel Tower to demonstrate their new ability to build a skyscraper with steel. In Chicago, we built sort of this ode to, I don't even know how to explain it. We built this ode to classical culture, but it was divided, so you had all of the technology on one end, and it was a city. They called it a city. So the white city, where all these gorgeous buildings, these white buildings that showed off like agricultural and scientific advancements. That's my circus page. Where's my white city? Yeah. The world's Columbia. So you can see some images of it here. This is a real poster from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. And unfortunately, that they put all of the other countries at the other end, not in the white city. Oh, yeah. So what's interesting about this are a couple of things. One, all the dances that came out of it. Two, that this article we have talks about why you would even want to do that. Like, if you were not an imperial power, if you're an imperial power and you want to show off your colony, look, I own this and this is where I'm mining for gold at the expense of the people who actually live there, whatever, that makes sense, right? But why would a country want to come to the World's Fair and be, you know, not in the white city and show off their country in this sort of like weird second class status? And the answer is because it was an act of political power and unification. So, and this is what this article is covering that I want you to get out of this article, is when you had an imperial power come to your country and then leave, and you left and you became a nation, the boundaries of your nation were not necessarily the boundaries of that land before the imperial power came and colonized you. Which is to say, and this happened a lot in Africa and many other places, you might have had, you know, 3 tribes living in the north and the south and the east. Yeah. And an imperial power comes in and just decimates all of you. And by the time you rise up, you've had to make peace and work together with the other 2 colonies, which might have been at war for hundreds of years before the colonizers came and landed. But because the colonizers were such an outside force, then the native people who used to see themselves as quite different now see themselves as one entity. And that obviously we know does not end the strife, right? There could still be factions of difference that still haven't really made peace. But in order to stop being colonized or recolonized, those nations brought themselves together, gave themselves a name, and are seeking to create their own identity on the world stage. And that was often done by presenting your nation at the World's Fair. And so we end up with that awful exoticization even in those moments, right? So you can see some pictures here with a caption where, you know, the Ceylon village might have been coming to show their dancing and their clothing, and they would often like build mock versions of their particular kind of architecture. This was pretty normal to like build a small city to show off your culture. And the act of doing that is so that you can say, we are the nation of fill in the blank X, and we want political power on the world stage. We want to be able to negotiate as a unit, to have tariffs or to have ships come that are going to, you know, respect our trade and pay our taxes when they come and sell us things. But when you're taking your culture, putting it in boxes on a ship, going halfway around the world and like building a mock version of your capital city, it's obviously going to suffer from those same effects of appropriation. And sometimes when the colonial power is still in effect, they would definitely hire native people to come over and build these arts and crafts or these buildings, but of course they're miniaturized. Of course, the people who have been brought across the country are exhausted from weeks and weeks of world travel, and if you run out of materials, you don't have those materials there. And also sometimes you might hire some other local cast members who are not actually from that country. And that definitely happened too. So just to pause on this topic, when you were a post-colonial country, sometimes you made a new culture that blended different previously separate native groups together. And you did that in order to gain power on the stage. So that act is by choice, and it's coming from the native people, but it's also changing their culture. Yeah? And when you are then in the World's Fair, you might change it again or highlight the things that are considered most interesting so that you can have more people paying for your like extra show down the way. And one of the things that we see in the circus is the introduction to America of belly dance. And I think you have some clips to watch of Little Egypt. But we can pull her up in the background. Little Egypt was in the Chicago's World Fair, and then literally hundreds of copycat Little Egypts showed up. She was considered totally scandalous because she was apparently bare-bellied in the Victorian time. Remember, all women are supposed to be corseted and fully covered from chin to shoe top. There's some discussion about whether she was actually naked here. Lots of the time, it's not true. There was like a piece of transparent cloth, but still, we don't see this as being scandalously dressed. But at the time, this was essentially like walking out in your stilettos and your underwear. And in actuality, Little Egypt was not from Egypt. She was of some sort of mysterious Eastern European origin. She might have been Romani, but she wasn't. But America and Victorian culture took her belly dancing to be what belly dancing is, period. And it became absolutely fetishized as erotic, even though not all belly dancing is necessarily supposed to be erotic, as opposed to it's usually entertaining. But it became the basis for skirt dancing, which we will talk about later. Can was influenced by it, and certainly cooch shows on the circus circuit were influenced forever by the way that she moved. So we will come back to that idea in a moment, but let me make sure we have covered our main topics here, which I think we have. There is this Bokongo cosmogram here, and it's I think one of the easiest ways for me to talk about how the way that formations are being made on the floor. Remember, I talked about how in Native American dances they're often performing with a circle of people around them or dancing in a circle. That also happens in the ring shout of slaves in oops, sorry. There's some autoplay going on here. And in the original African dances and in the ring shout in the South of America, I was like, not South America, it is danced in a counterclockwise manner specifically to embody the idea of passing from the living to the dead world. So that shape, that formation is really religiously important in movement, and that gets changed a lot of the time when you're doing breakdancing in a cipher, right? It's still round. It still holds that echo of the previous movement. But when you do it on America's Best Dance Crew, you're doing it to impress the judges. So you face it all to the front. Those are the main topics for today. I would like to ask you guys, yeah, we're good. I'd like to ask you guys if you have any questions or other ideas or things that just like popped up in your head, and if you're wondering if they're related in any way. And those could be American or non-American, dance forms, circuses that you've seen, anything at all that you want to throw into this conversation.
I kind of got something. It's a bit unrelated, but it got me sort of thinking on something.
Mm-hmm.
Did clowns first appear in circuses, or were clowns completely separate from circuses?
That is a really great question. I don't know the answer for sure, but I do know that clowning, as we mostly think of it today, a lot of it has to come from, or a lot of that training has been really codified, and therefore we see a lot of clowning that is based on the Italian practice. And there are like serious hundreds of years old clowning schools in Italy. You might have seen, I don't think I'm going to be able to pop up videos quickly enough, but these clowns, like if you think of Carnival or Mardi Gras and those images of like the jester hat, that clowning tradition is trained in basically clown universities that come from ancient Italian practices, and they were in Shakespeare, so you know that means like 1600s and before. But I suspect there's clowning from other countries. Do you guys know about clowning from other countries as well? Anybody?
Not that I know of.
I hope somebody is like, oh yeah, I've heard of clowning in another country. I would love to hear about that. Clowning, Italy. I can pull up an image while we're thinking about that. Anybody else have an idea? Or a thought? Totally off topic is very welcome. Do you guys have any questions? Is there anything that's not here? I found an image for you. That is some old clowning. Ancient Greece. Oh. Weird, freaky masks. Pantomime. Roman clowns. Jesters. Court fool. Scottish jesters. Yeah. Next week, we're going to talk about... Oh, I didn't take you with me. Sorry. Next week, we're going to talk about the aesthetic of cool. So this idea of the aesthetic of cool is really going to come up. It's an article about art, actually, written by Thompson, and it's going to talk about, by looking at ancient African art, it's going to talk about what the aesthetic or like the artistic value of coolness is and what it comes from culturally in different African cultures. And that's going to be the basis of the following article, which is going to be about Africanist elements. And we're going to use those elements to start being able to look at dances that are current and identify like, oh, that thing there, for example, the aesthetic of cool, is one of the ways that I know that I can reasonably guess that this form of art is Africanist, which is to say that it has evolved from African influences. Yeah. So when we talk about the Thompson article next week, we're going to talk about what the symbols of water and coolness are in African culture and how those things are different from the Western Eurocentric idea of coolness, which is, I simplify it in terms of thinking that's icy, right? Like what's cool as opposed to cold. Yeah. So we're going to think about that as a way of this discussion. We really spent time looking at how does the act of othering or saying that something is strange or different or unique, or like how that is both adding value and sort of pushing it away from the naming group that has the power. And then next week, we're going to start to look at how coolness and how the elements that make things look like, why does something look exotic from the Western Eurocentric perspective? And what are those things? And can we learn to identify them and value them so that we are not just saying, whoa, that's so wild, it's so exotic, right? But instead we're saying that is very polyrhythmic, that is very like super strong and athletic, that is very flexible in a way that seems impossible for that dancer's age, or basically to be able to value things with our words in a way that isn't accidentally putting them in a box of otherness that sort of makes them seem cheapened. Yeah. So that's why we're talking about these theoretical ideas as we watch dances. So please enjoy your circus videos this week. If you have suggestions on other circus videos you'd like to watch, or if you have questions about any of the dances that you've seen, I'd love to hear them. Please bring them or email them to next discussion. And with that said, it's time to go. Yes, Jacques.
Oh, I got another completely unrelated question.
Okay.
Does Hufflepuff or Ravenclaw get ever like any big feature in the movies? Because I like watched the fifth. I'm like up to the fifth movie right now, and I barely seen anything from Ravenclaw or Hufflepuff.
Much more after the fifth movie, but I think Cedric is a Hufflepuff. And
Yes.
yeah, I believe so. And I think also Cho Chang and Luna Lovegood are Ravenclaws that feature largely in the second half of the Harry Potter series. That really was off topic, but I will take it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Bye bye.
Thank you, guys.